All right, let's talk about cheap records. This is another edition of Cheap Heat, the videos that wipe your tears when you've lost that eBay auction or when somebody's raided your cart on Discogs and taken all your hard-earned goodies. Well, you haven't earned them yet. Anyway, there's tons of cheap records out there, and records that can be had for like 10 bucks or less, not including postage. If you look hard enough, you got to be persistent in this game. You can't just buy the first copy you see, but sometimes the first copy you see is the cheap one. Also check the condition. What we're listening to now, another thing to watch out for is multiple pressings. This record came out in several different pressings. I have the non-gatefold edition, which is the cheapest. This is guitarist Janne Schaffer's debut record, and he's a Swedish guitarist. This came out in the UK with a different track swapped in for another track, and it was called The Chinese. The track that they swapped in on this record is called The Chinese. They took a track off of this, though. They didn't just add to it. And that's real cheap. So Janne Schaffer, The Chinese, it's the same as this record except for one track, and it's really cheap. This is a later pressing with a non-gatefold cover. It's also cheaper than the OG. That's something that's actually really common. You know, look for later pressings. They repressed albums like crazy back in the 70s. And this guy was huge, and there's a reason for why this guy was so popular. He was in a group that you may have heard of, that your mom might have heard of and enjoy, called ABBA. He was their guitarist and musical director for decades. And basically financed, I think, his own solo career on the side, playing really cool jazz rock fusion. Financially, he was doing great, so he could do what he wanted to in his spare time. And so he recorded these great records. I love these records. He recorded these two. This is his second one. This is really inexpensive. There's copies of this now on Discogs for $5. Really high quality jazz rock fusion. He was in a group called Ablution also. That record is very expensive. But these records are kind of like Ablution Junior. It's even got a lot of the same guys on it. So if you dream about Ablution records, you can get these and you're like 2/3 of the way there. He recorded a couple records that were available as US pressings. One was called Catharsis. It's quite good. And there's a follow-up called Ear Meal, where he's sort of getting into the smoother aspects of fusion, but it's still worth having. I don't have either one, so I don't have every cheap heat there is. But his first and second records, Europe only, are great, and get them. Great players on these too. Peter Robinson, who later was in Brand X, who was in Ablution with Janne Schaffer, is on this. Bjorn Jason Lind on flute. Stefan Broland on bass. Ola Brunkert on drums, etc., etc. That was basically ABBA's backing band, and they were killer jazz musicians, as you can tell. I'm going to try to talk about a few more European artists in this edition of Cheap Heat. The next guy I want to discuss is Joachim Kuhn. Really amazing piano player, has done all kinds of challenging stuff, did a bunch of free jazz records for MPS and BYG back in the day, way back when I was little. Did a bunch of solo piano records. His new thing, he's still around, he's got to be in his 70s now, is investigating the music of Ornette Coleman, only on piano. He played with Ornette, I believe, towards the end of Ornette's career. Anyway, he also had a jazz funk fusion phase that yielded quite a bit of great records, some of which are very cheap. This one came out in the US and is still cheap. It's called Springfever, as you can tell. Just a really great funky jazz rock fusion record. It's not one of those records that overwhelms you, but this has been in and out of my collection over the years. It's just a really pleasant record. I really like it a lot, but it's not lame. It's pleasant, but not lame. It's kind of what I'm going for. There was a record after this that had a much more sort of rock-oriented rhythm section. It had Ray Gomez and Jan Ackerman on guitars. I don't own it, but it's very similar to this. But the drumming is a little less interesting. Jerry Brown's the drummer on this. John Lee's the bassist. Philip Catherine's the guitarist. Really great record, Springfever on Atlantic. On the record before that, Joachim Kuhn was still on MPS. This has gotten kind of expensive recently, but I think I'm gonna bet that you could probably dig up a copy at your local record store, or maybe a buy it now on eBay. Might still be in the single digits. But this is like a $15 or $20 record now. It's a really great funky fusion record with great personnel. Alphonse Mouzon on drums, John Lee, Nana Vasconcelos on percussion. There's Mouzon, Philip Catherine, and Terumasa Hino. Just a great record. Hip Elegy, it's called. And I played the grooves off of this thing when I was in high school. The ones before this were only Europe. Europe only, I mean. CinemaScope is the one to look for. Those are like 20, 30 buck albums. Alphonse Mouzon, I just mentioned him. Absolutely one of my favorite drummers. Was the original drummer in Weather Report. Played with McCoy Tyner for years. He was in Larry Coryell's 11th House. Amazing, amazing chops. Wonderful drummer and really multi-talented. Played keyboards, he sang, could do all kinds of stuff. Blue Note. Signed him as a solo record, as a solo artist in the early 70s. The Essence of Mystery was his first record on Blue Note. It's a little pricey these days. The follow-up, Funky Snakefoot, was more of a funk pop record. This record, Mind Transplant, is a heavy fusion record with Tommy Bolin on guitar. You really got to get this one. It's got some classic jazz rock fusion tunes on it. Great solos from Bolin, from Lee Ritenour, making an uncharacteristically heavy shot on this record. Jay Graydon on guitar, also well known for his work with Steely Dan, is on this. Mouzon on drums. A great keyboard player named Jerry Peters is on this. Really cool record. Couple of vocal tracks, but most of this is heavy fusion and can be had very inexpensively. After his contract with Blue Note expired or ran out or whatever, he went over to Europe and recorded a couple of records for MPS, one of my favorite labels. This was the first one, called Virtue. Had an interesting lineup. Welton Geit on electric bass, Gary Bartz on alto sax, and Stu Goldberg from the last edition of the Mahavishnu Orchestra on keyboards. They're getting down, man. Anyway, this is a really fantastic heavy fusion record. Lots of odd time signatures, lots of high energy hijinks. Really excellent. Can't recommend it highly enough. This one is the follow-up on MPS. It's even better, if you can imagine. Miroslav Vitus on bass, Bob Malik on tenor sax, Philip Catherine on guitar. I think Joachim Kuhn is on keyboards on this, as well as Stu Goldberg. Just a really great record, this. This is one to really look for. Both of them, especially if you're in Europe, can be had for single-digit euros. They were fairly well distributed in the U.S. by courtesy of Gem Records. Used to get those catalogs, those Gem catalogs. God, they were wonderful. It was like Christmas when the Gem catalog came out, and you'd see all these great import records. Another European band that made serious inroads into the U.S. Was Gong. And mostly because they were a psychedelic progressive rock band for years, led by Australian singer, guitarist, and composer David Allen, kind of a visionary dude, actually. Recorded a string of records with him. They got increasingly proggy, increasingly jazzy, increasingly improvisational, until eventually David Allen left the group and headed in a different direction, and Pierre Moerlen sort of took over, and it became a jazz rock fusion band. I like all Gong. It's like all Soft Machine. I like all the Soft Machine records. When they were a psychedelic band, I loved them. When they were a jazz rock band, I loved them. Gong, same deal. And the first real pure fusion jazz rock record that Gong did was Gaseous, Effervescent Gaseous. It came out in the US as Expresso. It's got a different cover with a big espresso machine on it. They're getting into some blues here. Anyway, Gaseous, classic record with Alan Holdsworth on guitar. And it's a must-own. Either in its American format or in its European format. Either way, you got to have this one. It's really a fantastic record. I prefer this one because of the cover. It's beautiful. I wish they'd made it gatefold. The early versions of this record had a poster too. Anyway, classic high energy fusion. There's some great mallet percussion work on it, courtesy of Pierre Moerlen and his brother Benoit, and a woman named Mireille Bauer also. So 3 percussionists who are amazing on that record. This album, Expresso II, continues in the same vein. Holdsworth is a guest soloist on this. Bon Lazaga, his successor on guitar, is also on this. Daryl Way is on this, the violinist from Daryl Way's Wolf and Curved Air. And then the usual Gong people. The bassist Hansford Rowe is on this. He stuck with the band pretty much to the bitter end. Really amazing player. Anyway, this was issued in the US and in Europe, so it's pretty well available, and it's really inexpensive. Expresso and Expresso II. Get them both if you're into the jazz rock fusion. Some lesser known things that Gong did on Arista that were available in the US, available in Europe. They did a live record without Holdsworth, but with Bon Lazaga and Hansford Rowe and the Mallet people. And Peter Lemur on keyboards, an amazing keyboard player. Played in all kinds of free jazz and avant-garde settings in England, but also did some really powerful fusion work, mostly with Gong. Anyway, the live record's really good. It had no personnel listing, no gatefold. The Euro edition might have, but when it came out in the US, it was almost issued as a cutout, it seemed like. Just the guitar on the back. I thought it was like a vocal record at first because of the cover, but it's not. It's high energy, all instrumental fusion, really great. He did another record, Pierre Moerlen's Gong did. He was working with Mike Oldfield, and he did a record with Oldfield called Downwind, and that really sounds like a Mike Oldfield record. I don't own it. I've had it. It's also cheap. It's also worth having. I don't have it, but you might want it, especially if you're a fan of Mike Oldfield. The next record in the Gong canon, in the Pierre Moerlen's Gong canon, was Time is the Key. And Daryl Way and Alan Holdsworth return on this one as guest soloists on a few tracks. But the core band remains Peter Lemur, Hansford Rowe, Bon Lazaga, Francois Kaus, a really great conga player, and of course Pierre Moerlen. This is really good. Short tracks, but it's a pretty cool moderate to high energy fusion record. I really like it a lot. And finally, they did a serious left turn with this one. It's called Leave It Open, Pierre Moerlen's Gong. And it got very limited distribution in the US via Gem. This was brought back to me from Germany by a friend. Long story there. But I've never seen it very much in the US, but it's really inexpensive. I used to think, a record that's hard to get is going to be expensive. That's not necessarily the truth. This is a really cool record, and it's got a really interesting guest soloist on it, Charlie Mariano, the saxophonist who was in Embryo and Eberhard Weber's group for years. Previously, he had recorded with Charles Mingus, had recorded with West Coast Jazz Crew in the 50s on Bethlehem and Pacific Jazz. Really interesting musician. You should check out Charlie Mariano. Did a bunch of solo records that are really worth having. Anyway, this is a fantastic jazz rock fusion record with great solos by Mariano. Of course, Lazaga, Hansford Rowe, and Kaus are on this, as well as Pierre Moerlen. Anyway, really worthwhile records, these Pierre Moerlen Gong records. A lot of you know about them already, like Passport, but maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. Now, I briefly mentioned Alan Holdsworth. There are some Alan Holdsworth influenced guitarists out there who made really outstanding records that could be had for little or no money. This one's a good example of such an album. The guitarist on this is Ronnie Johnson. This is a British record by a group called First Light, and the title is, you might not be able to see it, How the Land Lies. All original compositions, kind of a late 80s fusion sound on this, but definitely definitely a Holdsworth influence in the guitar chair. Some of this gets really involved. Other parts are more laid back. But it's a good buy if you're into inexpensive jazz rock fusion and you can forgive some of the peccadillos of the 80s. I like that one a lot. Another guitarist who kind of took Holdsworth's legato approach and made sort of a leap with it is our old friend Bill Connors. Connors was the original guitarist in Chick Corea's Return to Forever. He's on Hymn of the Seventh Galaxy, in my opinion, their best record. He kind of disappeared and then reappeared, recorded some acoustic records with ECM, and then his later records on ECM, he had a rhythm section. Those are beautiful records, by the way. And then he disappeared again, re-emerged in the mid-80s with these great fusion records. And these are killing. There's no lameness whatsoever on these records. He did 3 on the Pathfinder label out of New Jersey. This is the first one called Step It. It's got Dave Weckl on drums, Tom Kennedy on bass. Superb guitar playing on this. And just high energy, complex fusion. He did one called Double Up that I have on CD. I don't have it on LP, but it's cheap. And then the last one, the third one, is called Assembler. It's from '87. Again, no compromise here at all. Just heavy, complex fusion, beautiful work. Tom Kennedy, again, still on bass. The drummer on this is Kim Plainfield, taught for years at in a school in New York, at the Musicians Institute, I believe. And Bill Connors, of course, on guitars. If you dig the heavy jazz rock fusion, you're gonna want to find these Bill Connors records. Getting back into the European thing just a little bit, I'm going to talk about some less well-known artists. Ken Ram is another fine guitarist, not so much a Holdsworth acolyte as just a really excellent guitarist and musician. I didn't know anything about this record until a few years ago. A friend of mine said, "You should get this, you'd like it." Ken Ram recorded this in the early 80s. It sounds like it was made in the mid-70s. And the backing band on this is a group called FM. They're from Canada. So if you're into Canadian prog, you'll know them. They actually recorded some really interesting records that could be had for next to nothing. But this I didn't know about at all. And so it's Ken Ram, who's a great guitar player, wrote the tunes on this. The guys from FM are on this. Ben Mink on violin and mandolin. The drummer Martin Deller is on this. A different bassist though, David Pilch, who was top and remains a top session man in the jazz world in Canada. And the keyboard player is Ted Moses, who recorded a few records for that RCI label that are very sought after these days. Anyway, if you like, again, high energy fusion, you should search this one out. It's not expensive. It came out in Canada and in England, so there's multiple pressings. Really worth the effort. Great, very original, high energy fusion record. Another album that I knew about this one, and again, it was hard to get when I was a kid in the early 80s in college. It's pretty easy to get now. And it's very inexpensive. It's by a group called Second Vision, who were a bunch of talented Brits. 2 of them have heavy connections to the later edition of Soft Machine. John Etheridge, the guitarist, previously in Daryl Way's Wolf. He was in another band too. Shoot, it's escaping me at the moment. But anyway, he was in Daryl Way's Wolf. He was in Soft Machine, and he was in this group called Second Vision. Great band. The violinist from this group, Rick Sanders, also joined the later edition of Soft Machine and was in the Alive and Well recorded in Paris record, and he was in Softs as well. The rest of the band, highly capable British musicians, really well known for their studio work. The drummer is Mickey Barker. The bassist, John Davey, and the keyboardist Dave Bristow all made numerous recorded appearances, mostly in the rock field, but on this is a really good high-energy jazz rock fusion record. I discussed Passport in a previous edition of Cheap Heat. Well, Passport guys made some solo records that are also fairly inexpensive. I have a few minutes to talk about them. Kurt Kress Clan has most of Passport on it. It's a little bit less complicated, a little bit more laid back than Passport in their prime, but nevertheless, you should look for this one. It's got Volker Kriegel on guitar and Dave King on bass from Embryo, in addition to Christian Schultz on keyboards from Passport. Really cool record. There's some trumpet on a few tracks. Ak van Rooyen, really interesting player. I like this record a lot. I got this when I was in high school. Still have the copy. And the other one, and I'm going to wrap up with this, the other Passport solo project that you should check out that's cheap is Wolfhound by Wolfgang Schmidt, who is the guitarist and bassist in Passport. He recorded a bunch of records under this moniker, Wolfhound. I don't have any of those. Actually, I should check them out. This is the first one. It's quite good. Very, very funky. And it has some vocals. I think there's 3 vocal tracks on this, 2 or 3 or maybe 4. Really worthwhile, though. The rest of the record's heavy, funky jazz rock. I like it a lot. Kurt Kress on drums, Christian Schultz on keyboards, plus guests on flute and more keyboards. Anyway, that's it. All these records, well, most of them are pretty cheap, and you can find them, and you should go look for them if you like the funky jazz rock fusion. Take care.